Hi, this is Rob Kerner. I am the watershed biologist for the Glen Lake Association, and I'm joined here today with my colleague Joe Blondier. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be here.
Yeah, Joe and I, we worked together a lot. Career-wise, we worked at the Leelanau School for 25 years together in the same classroom, so we've got a lot of history behind us. But today we're going to be looking at our familiar friends, the snails and clams of Glen Lake. And in fact, when you think of snails and clams, there's a biological term that goes with that. We're talking about the mollusks, or I think in Latin, doesn't that mean soft-bodied animals? I believe it does. Yeah, all the soft-bodied animals, despite the fact they have shells. So let's take a look at some slides that I've got prepared here. And we're going to get right at it with the opening slide. This is a picture of the shallow water of Glen Lake on the North Shore near the marina. And you can see all that sandy bottom. What you don't see are a huge number of small black specks. And when you're on the water and you're traversing over this shoal, Joe, haven't you ever marveled at the number of snails that are in our lake?
It's we usually measure their density in number per square meter, and it can be a lot per square meter. But without all those little black specks, we wouldn't be having this beautiful view right here.
That's right. We'll talk more about that as we get into it. So let's take a look at the first slide. Glen Lake actually has a history of having a healthy population of freshwater clams. Sometimes people call them mussels or bivalves, bi meaning two, valve meaning shells. And I know that there's stories along the shoreline of Glen Lakers coming up for the summer and actually putting numbers on these and having clam races. Can you imagine that? Yeah, they actually know the clams by their number that they paint with nail polish, and they put them back in the lake, and then they would put them in an area and see which one could traverse down the bottom of the lake to the other end of the quote unquote finish line. Have you ever eaten clams, Joe?
I used to. It wouldn't be good now. I'm allergic.
Yeah. You know what they do to make them more edible is they feed them cornmeal, so that their whole digestive tract has got cornmeal in it instead of mud and other things that they sift out of the bottom. So when you finally cook them and eat them, they taste better. But we're worried about this clam because they're almost completely gone now from our watershed. And we'll talk more about why that is in just towards the end of our presentation. And this is some of the smallest clams we have. These are called fingernail clams. And they're harder to find. You don't see them like you do the big clam that we just saw prior. What's your first reaction, Joe, when you see these things?
Well, it almost looks like a little handful of sand or something.
Yeah.
It's good to know that they're not. Sometimes when you see little tiny snails now, it's the New Zealand mud snail, which is an invasive species,
right,
that we need to keep an eye on.
This could almost be confused with eggs of something, or when you really start to put this in your hand, they have these really thin shells, and so if you put too much pressure on it with your fingers, they'll actually collapse. So they're kind of fragile, and they do, in terms of the history of how they live out their lives on Glen Lake, they actually are filter feeders. They strain the water and collect any microscopic plants and animals or bacteria, and they feed on it. So here is the fingernail clams. And this is obviously not a clam. We're moving into our program where we talk about snails. This is what is referred to as the Campyloma snail. And there's a lot of these in the river, especially in the sandy bottoms. You have to almost dig for these to see them. They're completely buried in the sand, and the only time I've discovered them in the river bottom where I live is by scraping the sand so hard that eventually these things rise to the surface, and they're one of the largest snails we have in our watershed. And their snails come in different kinds. We have the what are referred to as the gill or palmate, or sometimes people call them the lung snails. And this one is an operculated snail where they can pull all that soft body tissue into their shell and cover it with a trap door so that everything on the outside is completely covered in hard surfaces. And I'm sure that has something to do with predation, doesn't it, Joe?
That would make sense, yeah. Or maybe an attempt to keep all those parasites out of them.
Right. And contrast, this is a tiny snail. In fact, this snail is so small that it was overlooked for many years on the research level for Glen Lake because of it's just hard to find. You literally put it in your hand and you feel like you got a grain of sand and you're just wondering, what is this? But when you look close under a microscope, I think this is magnified like 45 times. And wow. This is a snail called Gyralis. And what's interesting about this snail, Joe, is that the snail has had a recent play out in the swimmer's itch life cycle. That for years we've overlooked this snail, and now we realize that it actually has some parasites that are, from people's point of view, problematic.
Yep.
And so this is the tiniest of all snails in Glen Lake, as opposed to the biggest. And this is a recent discovery. This snail, actually, we've known has been in the Glen Lake watershed. Have you ever, Joe, have you ever been on a boat and you've seen these things kind of floating on the surface where they can trap air?
Mm-hmm.
So they actually have this bubble raft that they can hang on to. But what's interesting about this snail is we always kind of look beyond it to other snail species we'll talk about in a few minutes. But this snail actually harbors a parasite that we just found out about 2 years ago. In fact, it has a parasite that causes swimmer's itch that was never known to science. It was a brand new species. And I know in science, that's kind of like a big deal, isn't it?
That's a big deal to be able to name something.
Yeah, and so we're anxiously awaiting for the published paper that actually talks about this new species of parasite, and it comes from this snail that we never suspected was part of the life cycle of swimmer's itch. It's called the ram's head, or the ram's horn snail is the name of it. I think not too many people watching this video are going to be able to catch me on names because most people don't know the names of all these snails, and I've had a hard time memorizing them myself, but it's a good exercise.
This one makes sense. It looks like a ram's horn.
Yeah. This snail actually is famous. It's called the Physa snail, Physa. It's famous for harboring the parasites that cycle through mallards. And so when you see mallards around and their fecal material sinks to the bottom, the little myricydia come out as eggs hatching. These worms get into this body of this Physa snail. And Joe, can you imagine, like, I don't know, I'm not going to ask you how much you weigh, but I weigh 140 pounds. Can you imagine 70 pounds of my weight would be the parasite that lives inside me, and the other 70 pounds is the Rob Carner weight? I mean, it's just incredible.
Incredible that over half their biomass is parasite.
Yeah. So all these snails that we're talking about live in our watershed. This is the Physa snail, and they are a lung snail. Remember, we talked about some snails can pull their soft parts into their shell, be totally capped off by a hardened surface that covers the aperture or hole. But this one is vulnerable to predation because it can't do that. But it's not a very big snail. It's hard to scale these things in the slideshow, but This is a step up from the Gyralis that we talked about as one of the smallest snails. And this is the snail that I'm sure most people who boat around Glen Lake and, like for an example, come into the shallows near Fisher Canal, or if they go over to the shallows near the On the Narrows Marina, and you're into these huge sandy shoals. This is one of the most populated snails in our watershed. This is Pleuroceira, or another name for it is Goniabasis. These are kind of hard names to remember, but this is a very sturdy snail in the sense that their populations are strong and they have the ability to pull all their soft parts in and guard that opening with an aperture or a operculum. So this is a very common snail, but oddly enough, as common as it is, it's not one of the big carriers for swimmer's itch. It's quite a pronounced spiral there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful shell.
So, Joe, why don't you talk to us about these snails from an ecological point of view? We were looking here at the tongue of a snail on a glass aquarium, and you can see this unusual tongue, and then, of course, a comparison tongue on an octopus. Tell us about what's going on here.
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that snails are a really important part of a healthy ecosystem. And so a really diverse, offering of snails is really indicative of good water quality. And what they're doing with the radula here, the tongue part, is they're scraping the surfaces to get the algae off of those and feed on it. And one of the kind of really basic things about a food chain is that you lose about 90% of the energy at each step. And so when you've got sunlight coming down to plants, most of that's lost as heat and other things, and the plants only can save about 10% of that. And then the herbivore that comes along and eats the plant loses 90% of the energy that's in the plant. So when you think about the bottom of the food chain, you have to have more organisms at the bottom than you do at the top. And so snails being one of those lower organisms on the food chain, it's really important to have lots of those snails. And when they're scraping all that stuff with their radulas, they're keeping the bottom of the lake from being covered with algae and really allowing that beautiful sand to show through. But as we get other filter feeders and they remove things from the water gets clearer. And clear water is not the same thing as clean water, but that clear water allows more sunlight to get in, which allows more algae to grow. So a lot of snails is a really good thing for keeping the bottom of the lake from being completely covered with algae.
Yeah, I think most people commonly think of the aquarium experience at home as a kid or even today as adults. And you got to have a few snails in your aquarium to help keep that glass clean so you can see your beautiful fish inside your aquarium. And this is no different. These snails really help us have that pristine look on our watershed. And again, the biodiversity is important. It indicates, as you say, really clean, healthy ecosystems.
Got to have the algae eaters.
Yeah, so this is a picture of a lung snail that's probably had the most focus of any of the snails in our watershed. This is called the Stagnicola snail. And the reason it had the most attention is that over the decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a real attempt to try to kill this snail. And it had to kill because of the methods, the copper sulfate as a molluscicide or a snail killing compound. We were trying to kill this snail. And oddly enough, we were killing all the other species as well that we didn't at the time think had anything to do with swimmer's itch. So it's a shame, and we kind of owe this snail an apology as with all the others. Why were we trying to kill it? Is just because we wanted to get rid of swimmer's itch. And so this Stagnicola snail, they have, out of all the other snails, they have what we think of as a kind of a pinkish colored shell, which turns white when they're dead. And they live about a year, sometimes two, in the water. And every year they send off the next generation of snails with a lot of eggs that are wrapped in a jelly-like mass. So when the people back in the day trying to kill this, the snails with molluscicide, which we actually put a stop to that in the early 80s because we wanted to try a different method of live trapping and relocating mergansers. But suffice to say that this snail always was rebounding from the attack of humans and the copper sulfate, because the poison would then kill all the adults, and everybody says, well, that was a good run. We killed all the snails, but behind the poison were these jelly-like, sort of egg-like structures with individual snails that hatch after the chemical went inert. And guess what? The limnaeid snail, or the stagnicolous snails, were back on the bottom of the lake and populating faster than you could ever imagine. And within 2 to 3 weeks, you had a whole new population or crop of this snail. And it was too costly to go back and try to do another application of copper sulfate. So this is how this snail survived the onslaught. Pretty robust, huh?
Very resilient.
So when we look at snails and clams, everything we've talked about so far has been native as opposed to invasive. Joe, when you think of those two terms, how do you kind of separate them in your mind?
Yeah, natives are ones that evolved in an area. They've been there for a long, long time. They've got predators and prey that have been there, and they kind of keep each other in balance. And an invasive is something that's very recently moved into an area, usually with human help, and it's something that probably doesn't have a lot of predators, and so its population grows exponentially.
So what's this picture? What's the story here?
And it looks like we've got either zebra or quagga mussels, and they love to attach to things. They need a substrate to attach to. They have an incredible glue that they produce that attaches them to things, and these little byssal threads and stuff. But they're using these native clams as their substrate.
And you think both of these are filter feeding the water?
Well, the zebra mussels are. I don't know if the clams can get their siphons out anymore or
That's
not.
right. It's almost like if I were to take a whole bunch of animals and put them around your mouth and your nose and your nostril. You're trying to breathe and eat, and everything's in the way of what you're trying to do, so you end up dying. So this is a sad picture, really, in a lot of ways, with these zebra mussels having come in 2002. They have populated Little Glen and Big Glen and the fissures and the river. They're impossible to get rid of. And when you do plankton toes, you can actually see all the baby zebra mussels are called veligers, and they dominate the plankton at certain times. And they're at the mercy of the wind and the currents, and they just spread across the lake like wildfire. So here's a cool slide I like. It actually shows different views, lateral views and side views of the zebra mussel on the top, having that characteristic banding that looks like, markings of a zebra animal. And then the quagga mussel below pretty much has similar shape, but less markings that are pronounced in terms of the stripes. And their size is a little bit bigger. And we don't think in our watershed we have quagga mussels yet. If we do, they're likely going to be in the deeper water, whereas the zebra mussels like the shallow water. And so we're keeping an eye on it. Likely if quagga mussels were to take hold and, as you say, Joe, get exponentially growing in our watershed, it might be taking our lake and making it even more clear and transparent, and maybe even more beautiful to the human eye, but not ecologically necessarily more beautiful. Another invader that we're worried about This is the Chinese mystery snail. And this snail has a very strong ability to reproduce its numbers quickly and can outcompete our native snails, probably most closely looking like that Pleurocera or Goniabasis. But these guys we don't want in our watershed for sure, and our boat wash operations help protect us from this. And then the banded mystery snail that you talked about, this is definitely in neighboring lakes. Long Lake, I believe, just near Traverse City has this snail in their lake. And so far, we don't think in Glen Lake we have it. We've done enough studies with our swimmer's itch research to know what snails we have and which ones we don't. It's possible though, isn't it? It's a big lake.
It's a needle in a haystack. Same thing as a snail in a big lake.
Yeah. So that's our slideshow. I thought, Joe, we kind of covered the, I don't want to say the low life of Glen Lake, but certainly we covered a taxonomic group known as the soft-bodied animals, the mollusks, including clams and snails. So what's your take home after thinking about all these concepts? We've talked about taxonomy and ecology and biodiversity. What sticks with you?
Well, I just hope people have kind of a new maybe appreciation for the role that these snails do in keeping the bottom of the lake with the algae, keeping it under control. And we're lucky with our phosphorus levels. We don't have huge blooms of algae on a regular basis, but hopefully they appreciate the role that the snails are doing. And, you know, while it's swimmer's itch is definitely, you know, inconvenient for the people who get it, but you know, the snails in other parts of the world that can live in human blood can cause a disease called schistosomiasis, and it's a lot more dangerous. So I'm grateful for the snails we do have, and we need to keep that diversity up so that invading snails can't get as much of a foothold.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Joe. And that's it for the mollusks of Glen Lake. Signing off. Take care.
Thanks, Rob.